The quiet before the storm. The sleepy town of Millbrook, nestled between rolling hills and thick woods, seemed to offer a postcard image of peace and quiet. Its cobbled streets, quaint shops, and a close-knit community suggested a place where time moved slower. But as the morning mist lifted from the rooftops, revealing the town's true nature, it became evident that beneath this tranquil exterior lay deep-rooted divisions that had survived generations. John Richards, a 79-year-old Black Army veteran, was no stranger to Millbrook's complexities. Having returned to his hometown after serving decades in the military, John had hoped to spend his later years in peace. He had witnessed countless moments of conflict and sacrifice, both abroad and at home. Yet it was his belief in humanity, in the idea that his service had contributed to a more just and equal society, that kept him grounded. On this particular day, John woke up early, his body still feeling the aches and pains of age. His military service, though long behind him, had left its marks, scars, both visible and invisible, that told the story of a man who had given more than most for his country. His routine, carefully honed over the years, was slow but deliberate. After shaking and showering, he meticulously dressed in his favorite outfit, a pair of neatly pressed slacks, a white shirt, and the jacket that proudly displayed his service medals. Each time he put on the jacket, he felt both pride and the weight of the memories that came with it. Today, he had a simple plan in mind: breakfast at the local café, Eleanor's. Normally, he'd go there without a second thought. It was a place where the waitstaff knew his name, where regulars greeted him with smiles. But the café had recently closed for renovation, and John found himself at a crossroads. Where would he go for breakfast? Millbrook was a town where everyone knew everyone, and John had heard whispers about a new café on Main Street called Charlie's Diner. People had spoken about it in glowing terms, praising its friendly staff and down-home cooking. It had garnered a reputation for comfort food, and John figured it might be worth trying something new. After all, how different could it be from Eleanor's? Despite his optimism, there was an unspoken hesitation as he left his house. Millbrook wasn't known for its progressive ideals. There were still places in town where people like him weren't always welcome. But John wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not one rooted in prejudice. He'd lived through far worse. The streets of Millbrook were just beginning to stir as John walked the few blocks to the café. He passed familiar faces, some of whom nodded in greeting, while others quickly looked away, their discomfort evident. John had long since learned to ignore these small slights, though they still stung in the quiet of his heart. His service to his country hadn't shielded him from the discrimination he'd faced throughout his life. Finally, he reached Charlie's Diner. The building was small but welcoming, with a wooden sign hanging above the door, painted with the words, "A friendly place for all." John paused, his eyes lingering on the slogan. Friendly for all, he mused. It was a nice sentiment, one he hoped would ring true. As he pushed open the door, the small bell above it jingled softly, announcing his arrival. The interior was cozy, filled with wooden tables and booths, the kind of place where the smell of coffee and frying bacon instantly put you at ease. A few patrons sat at their tables, chatting quietly or reading the morning paper. For a moment, John allowed himself to relax, taking in the warm atmosphere. A young waitress, whose name tag read Ellie, approached him with a bright smile. "Good morning, sir. Table for one." "Yes, please," John replied, his voice calm and steady. Ellie led him to a booth by the window, offering him a menu and asking if he'd like a coffee to start. "That would be great," John said, settling into the booth. He watched her walk away before turning his attention to the menu. As he read through the breakfast offerings, his stomach growled at the thought of scrambled eggs, sausage, and crispy hash browns. It sounded perfect. As he waited for his coffee, John couldn't help but scan the room. Years of military service had made him hyper-aware of his surroundings, a habit he'd never quite shaken. The diner seemed harmless enough. A couple of older men reading their newspapers, a group of teenagers laughing at a table in the back, and a few families enjoying a leisurely Sunday breakfast. There was nothing out of the ordinary, yet something about the place didn't sit right with John. Then the door to the kitchen swung open, and a middle-aged man in a crisp white apron stepped out. John immediately recognized him as the owner, Charlie, the man whose name was plastered on the sign outside. Charlie was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen a fair share of hard days. His expression was neutral as he scanned the room, but when his gaze landed on John, something shifted. Charlie's face tightened. His smile, which had been there moments earlier for other patrons, vanished. The easygoing friendliness he'd shown to everyone else was nowhere to be found. John had seen this look before, the look that told him he was not welcome. It was a look that had followed him throughout his life, in different towns, different places, but always the same meaning. John didn't flinch. He met Charlie's gaze head-on, his years of experience in the military teaching him never to back down from a confrontation. The two men locked eyes for what felt like an eternity before Charlie turned on his heel and disappeared back into the kitchen. John's stomach tightened with unease. He had hoped that Millbrook had changed, that maybe this new cafe would be a place where he could simply enjoy a meal like everyone else. But the momentary hope he'd felt when he walked through the door was quickly fading. Ellie returned with his coffee, placing it gently on the table. "Have you decided what you'd like to order?" she asked, her smile unwavering. John cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the tension he felt creeping into the pit of his stomach. "Yes, I'll have the scrambled eggs, sausage, and hash browns. And maybe a side of toast." Ellie scribbled down his order and flashed another smile. "Coming right up." As she walked away, John took a deep breath and tried to focus on the warmth of the coffee in his hands, the comforting aroma filling his senses. He had learned long ago to pick his battles carefully, to know when to stand his ground and when to walk away. Today, he decided he would wait. He would wait to see if the kindness Ellie showed was the true face of Charlie's diner, or if the coldness in Charlie's eyes was a warning of something worse to come. Outside the window, the town of Millbrook carried on, unaware of the quiet storm brewing inside its newest establishment. A growing chill. The cafe's air seemed to cool the moment Charlie vanished into the back. John sat in his booth by the window, his hands clasped tightly around his cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into his skin but not quite reaching his bones. He stared into the swirling black liquid, his reflection barely visible. He thought of the countless places he had been, foreign lands torn by war, cities full of strangers, and towns much like this one, where the veneer of kindness was often as thin as the skin of a bubble, always on the verge of bursting. A dull ache in his knee reminded him of his age, of the miles he had walked in boots worn thin, and the years that had passed since he first enlisted. For all his service, for all the times he had faced enemy fire or endured the brutal heat of a far-off desert, it was these quiet moments, in places like this, that often hurt the most. The invisible battles waged not with fists or guns, but with glances and whispers. These were the ones that lingered. The clink of dishes and the murmur of conversations filled the diner, but John felt apart from it all. He was no stranger to this sensation, the creeping isolation that settled in when you knew you were being watched, judged, even if no one said a word. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, a sixth sense honed over decades, and without turning his head, he knew eyes were on him. 2 tables over, an older couple, likely in their 60s, whispered quietly, their gazes darting toward him every few seconds. John caught the woman's eyes for a split second before she looked away, but her expression lingered in his mind. It wasn't overt malice, but more of a quiet discomfort, the kind that was just as dangerous because it was so insidious. It was the look of someone who would never cause a scene themselves, but who wouldn't step in to stop one either. John shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the tension building in his chest. He reminded himself that he had faced far worse than judgmental stares. Yet here, in the heart of a town he had once called home, it hurt in a way that felt more personal. This wasn't some distant battlefield. This was supposed to be his sanctuary. He hadn't come here looking for a fight, but the unspoken hostility made him wonder if one was brewing, just beneath the surface. The door to the kitchen swung open again, and Charlie re-emerged, his apron now gone, replaced by a flannel shirt. His heavy boots clomped across the diner floor as he made his way toward the counter, not sparing John a second glance. He started chatting with a few of the regulars who sat on bar stools, leaning in close to laugh at some shared joke. There was a casualness to the way he ignored John that felt deliberate, almost as if acknowledging his presence would disturb the comfortable world Charlie had built for himself here. John took a sip of his coffee, though it had cooled significantly. He noticed the group of teenagers in the back of the diner had also started casting glances his way. One of them, a boy with shaggy blonde hair, whispered something to his friend, who smirked and muttered a reply. John could feel their eyes on him like the weight of the sun, unavoidable, hot, and glaring. The quiet murmurs grew louder, as if the entire diner was tuning into the same unspoken conversation. John's heartbeat quickened, but his expression remained calm, years of discipline and self-control keeping him from reacting to what was happening around him. He had learned long ago that rising to the bait was exactly what people like this wanted. They wanted a reaction, something they could twist into a justification for their own behavior. Ellie returned, balancing a large plate of food in her hands. She smiled as she set it down in front of him, oblivious to the tension that had begun to fill the room. "Here you go, sir. Scrambled eggs, sausage, hash browns, and toast, just like you ordered." John looked up at her and gave her a small, polite smile. "Thank you, Ellie. It looks great." She beamed at him before turning to the next table, seemingly unaware of the silent exchanges happening all around. For a moment, John allowed himself to focus on the food in front of him, the comforting sight of a warm breakfast. The smell of the sausage and eggs brought back memories of his army days, when a good meal was a rare but cherished thing. He picked up his fork and took a bite, savoring the taste, even as the unease continued to simmer just beneath his surface. As he ate, the whispers continued, soft but persistent. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. It was the same everywhere. An outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who had dared to step into a space that wasn't meant for him. Even here, in his hometown, after serving his country, the message was clear. His presence wasn't welcome. Suddenly, a loud, scraping sound broke the tension like glass shattering on a hard floor. John looked up to see one of the teenagers, a tall boy with a backwards baseball cap, pushing his chair back aggressively as he stood. The boy glanced at his friends, smirking, before making his way over to the counter where Charlie was standing. John watched as the boy leaned in and said something to Charlie, who gave a brief nod in response. The boy then turned and shot John a look that was hard to read, somewhere between amusement and disdain. John set his fork down, his appetite quickly fading. The subtle movements of the diner, the whispers, the side glances, it was all leading somewhere, and John could feel the shift coming. Charlie wiped his hands on a towel, tossing it over his shoulder as he stepped away from the counter and walked over to John's booth. The clink of dishes and the low hum of conversation seemed to quiet as the rest of the diner watched. John didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes meeting Charlie's as the man approached. There was no fear in John's gaze, only a weary resolve that came from years of enduring moments like this. He had faced worse. He had faced far worse. Charlie stopped beside the booth, his arms crossed over his chest. For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, and John could hear the soft intake of breaths from the other patrons, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. "I think," Charlie began slowly, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "it might be best if you finished up and left. We've got regulars here who like to enjoy their breakfast in peace." John blinked, his face betraying no emotion. He had heard this before, so many times in so many places, but each time it still cut deep. It wasn't about the food, or the diner, or even the people watching. It was about the message. You're not wanted here. He let out a slow breath before speaking. I'm just having breakfast like anyone else. I didn't realize that was a problem. Charlie's face hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly. It's not about that. It's just, this place has a certain atmosphere. We try to keep things comfortable, you know. Comfortable. There it was. The word that was meant to disguise prejudice as politeness. The word that told John everything he needed to know about the kind of man Charlie was. John nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Charlie's. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also wasn't going to shrink away. Not here. Not now. Not after everything he had endured. Comfortable, John repeated, his voice steady. That's an interesting way to put it. Charlie shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke through the tension. Both men turned to see Ellie standing near the counter, her face flushed with emotion. Charlie, what are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling slightly but filled with conviction. He's done nothing wrong. He's just having breakfast. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Ellie's outburst had caught everyone off guard, including Charlie. Standing firm, the diner fell into a tense silence, the kind that stretched time like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap. John, sitting rigid in his booth, watched as Ellie's small yet defiant figure stood out against the backdrop of the cafe's cozy atmosphere. Her voice, though trembling, had pierced through the veneer of polite indifference that hung over the place, and now everyone was watching her. The moment felt heavy, as if something pivotal had just shifted but had yet to fully land. Charlie, caught off guard by her challenge, blinked rapidly. He was used to running things his way. The cafe was his domain, where his word was law. But now this quiet waitress was openly questioning him, and he wasn't sure how to respond. The frustration was clear in the way his lips tightened, his hand balling into a fist at his side. Ellie, Charlie began, his voice laced with warning. This doesn't concern you. I'm just making sure the place stays comfortable for everyone. Ellie's cheeks flushed redder, but she didn't back down. Instead, she took a small step forward, standing just behind the counter, her apron fluttering slightly as if in its own rebellion. She shot a quick glance toward John, who sat still as a statue, his eyes carefully watching the exchange. Comfortable for who exactly? She asked, her voice firmer now. Because it sure doesn't seem like you're worried about everyone. A murmur spread through the diner, a low buzz of discomfort as the other patrons shifted in their seats. The group of teenagers by the back wall exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsure whether to continue with their snickering or to keep quiet. The elderly couple across the aisle, who had been casting those uncomfortable stares at John earlier, suddenly seemed intent on studying their half-empty coffee cups. The tension was palpable, rising like the air before a storm. John, ever the soldier, felt the weight of this moment not as an outsider, but as a man who had walked this path too many times before. The battles had been fought in different places, some as far-flung as desert battlefields, others in boardrooms or small towns like this. The faces changed, but the essence remained the same. Prejudice, however quiet or disguised, was still prejudice. He knew this situation was escalating, and yet he felt a strange calm settle over him. He had nothing to prove here. Charlie's frustration finally cracked through his attempt at maintaining composure. He turned to Ellie, his voice dropping into a growl. Ellie, if you don't like the way I run things, you're welcome to find work somewhere else. You think this is easy? Keeping things running smoothly, making sure our customers feel at home. His voice was low enough that only Ellie, John, and a few of the closer tables could hear him clearly, but his intent was obvious. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a power play. Ellie's eyes widened slightly at the thinly veiled threat, but she didn't falter. Something in her had ignited, and it wasn't about to be snuffed out easily. John, sensing that the young waitress was in dangerous territory, decided it was time to intervene, though not in the way Charlie or anyone else might have expected. He set down his coffee cup, the ceramic clinking softly against the saucer. The noise, though quiet, seemed to cut through the murmur of the diner like a bell tolling. John straightened in his seat, his broad shoulders shifting slightly, and he looked up at Charlie, his voice steady but firm. "I don't think this is about comfort, Charlie. At least not for everyone. I've been in enough places, seen enough things, to know when someone's trying to hide behind a word like that." Charlie's head whipped around to face John, his jaw clenched tightly. For a moment, his eyes flashed with something dangerous, but then he composed himself. He crossed his arms over his chest, standing taller, but the confidence in his posture was more forced than before. The entire diner seemed to be holding its collective breath. "You've got it all wrong, John," Charlie said, his voice low but sharp. "I'm just running a business. I have regulars, who?" John interrupted, his tone calm but cutting. "Who don't like the idea of a black man having breakfast here. You're not saying it out loud, Charlie, but it's plain enough to see. You're more concerned about keeping things comfortable for them, aren't you?" John's words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, no one dared to move. Charlie's face twisted, a mixture of anger and something else. Shame, maybe. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was caught, trapped by the truth of John's statement, and everyone in the diner knew it. Ellie, emboldened by John's stand, stepped closer, her voice gaining strength. "Charlie, this isn't right. He's done nothing wrong. If anyone should leave, it's the people who are making him feel unwelcome, not the other way around." Charlie's face flushed red now, his frustration growing as the situation spiraled out of his control. He looked around the diner, as if seeking some kind of validation from the other patrons, but what he found was silence. The regulars who had always supported him, who had laughed at his jokes and praised his food, were now uncomfortably quiet. The elderly couple shifted in their seats, looking anywhere but at Charlie. Even the teenagers in the back seemed to have lost their bravado, their smirks replaced by uncertainty. John remained calm, his gaze steady as he watched Charlie. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he wasn't going to back down either. He had spent too many years fighting for freedom and equality to let this moment pass without standing up for himself, and for others like him who had been told, too many times, that they didn't belong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charlie exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly. He rubbed a hand over his face, clearly struggling with how to salvage the situation. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more resigned. "Look, John, maybe I was out of line. I've got to keep the peace here, you know." John leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Charlie's. "Peace at the cost of dignity isn't peace at all. It's just silence. And I didn't fight for this country so that people like me would have to stay silent when we're treated like this." Charlie's gaze faltered. For the first time, there was no trace of defiance in his expression, only the weight of his own actions sinking in. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and took a step back, his arms falling to his sides. Ellie, sensing that the tension was finally beginning to ease, stepped closer to John, placing a hand on the edge of his table. "Would you like some more coffee?" she asked softly, her voice a gentle contrast to the heated exchange. John smiled at her, a small but genuine smile. "I think I'd like that, yes." As Ellie went to grab the coffee pot, the rest of the diner slowly began to stir. Conversations, which had been halted in the thick of the conflict, resumed at a tentative pace. The regulars, though still clearly uncomfortable, began to pick at their breakfasts again. The teenagers whispered among themselves, but the hostility had drained from their expressions. John watched Charlie retreat back to the counter, where he stood silently, staring down at the register as if lost in thought. It wasn't a victory, not in the traditional sense, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, Charlie would think twice next time. Ellie returned with the coffee, pouring it carefully into John's cup. She gave him a soft smile, her eyes full of quiet gratitude. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she whispered, "but I'm glad you didn't back down." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes standing your ground is the only choice you have. And as he sipped his coffee, letting its warmth spread through him, John realized that in this small diner, in this small town, a ripple had started. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. He unexpected witness. As the uneasy calm settled over the cafe, John quietly sipped his coffee, appreciating its warmth but still feeling the weight of the confrontation. He had no illusions about what had just happened. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a snapshot of something much larger, a battle that had been fought for generations, and one that, despite progress, still had a long way to go. He was used to this fight, used to standing his ground. But the exhaustion of it, the sheer repetition, often hit him harder than the moment itself. Ellie, who had shown such bravery, continued her work, though with a newfound sense of purpose. Every now and then, she glanced in John's direction, as if to reassure herself that she had done the right thing, even if the consequences were still uncertain. Meanwhile, the patrons of the cafe resumed their conversations, though the mood remained awkward. The words exchanged just moments ago had peeled back a layer of their comfortable ignorance, and now they were left grappling with what they had witnessed. But there was one person who hadn't moved since the confrontation began. Seated in the far corner, behind a tall plant that offered some level of privacy, was a man who had watched everything unfold in silence. His presence went unnoticed by most, but John had seen him the moment he entered the cafe. His face was familiar, though John couldn't immediately place him. The man wore a crisp, dark suit, with his hat placed neatly on the table beside him. His expression had remained unreadable throughout the confrontation, neither disapproving nor supportive, just watchful. Now, as the tension in the cafe began to settle, the man in the suit stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket and picking up his hat. He walked with a deliberate pace, not rushed but not lingering either, until he reached John's table. Without asking, he pulled out a chair across from him and sat down. John's eyes flicked up, meeting the man's steady gaze. "John," the man said softly, almost casually, as if they were old friends picking up where they'd left off. John raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly. "You know my name." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I do. I make it a point to know about people like you." The statement, cryptic as it was, hung in the air. There was something about this man, something that set him apart from the usual faces John encountered in small towns like this. He was polished, confident, and carried himself with an air of authority that was difficult to ignore. But it wasn't just his demeanor that caught John's attention. It was the fact that this stranger seemed entirely unbothered by what had just transpired. Most people would have looked away, tried to pretend they hadn't seen anything. But this man had sat there, watching it all unfold like a silent observer. "Who are you?" John asked, keeping his voice calm, though his curiosity was piqued. The man leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been following your story for a while. You've made quite a name for yourself, both on and off the battlefield." John's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he didn't like the ambiguity. "And what exactly do you want from me?" The man's smile widened, though it remained just as enigmatic. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to offer you something." Before John could respond, the man continued, his voice steady and composed. "You see, people like you, people who have faced the kind of challenges you faced, are rare. You've endured prejudice, discrimination, and hatred, but you've also served your country with honor. That combination, it makes you more powerful than you realize." John's instinct was to brush off the flattery, but something about the man's tone gave him pause. This wasn't just empty praise. There was a deeper undercurrent to his words, something that suggested he knew more about John's past than he was letting on. The man leaned back, studying John's expression. "Tell me, How long do you plan to keep fighting these small battles? Defending yourself in places like this? Do you ever wonder if there's more you could do, more impact you could have? John frowned, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his coffee cup. What exactly are you getting at? The man tilted his head, as if considering how much to reveal. There are people out there, powerful people, who are looking for men like you. Men with integrity, with a sense of justice. Men who won't back down, even when the odds are against them. These people, they have influence. They can make changes on a scale far beyond what you're dealing with here. John sat back, his arms crossed over his chest. And they just happen to be looking for someone like me. The man chuckled softly. Nothing happens by chance, John. You've attracted attention, whether you meant to or not. People are watching, and they're interested in what you'll do next. There was a long pause as John considered the man's words. He didn't know what to make of this stranger or his vague offer, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random conversation. The man was here for a reason, and whatever it was, it had been in the works for a while. Finally, John spoke, his voice measured. I'm not interested in playing someone else's game. I've fought for my country, for my people, and for my own dignity. That's enough for me. The man nodded, seemingly unsurprised by John's response. I figured you might say that, and I respect it. But just know that the offer stands. When you're ready to do more than just survive these battles, when you're ready to change the game itself, we'll be here. With that, the man stood up, placing his hat back on his head with a smooth, practiced motion. He looked down at John one last time, his expression unreadable but filled with a quiet intensity. Don't wait too long, John, the man said softly. The world is changing, and men like you are in short supply. And with that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving John to sit alone with his thoughts. The weight of the man's words lingered long after he had gone, like the echo of a distant drumbeat. John's gaze followed him to the door, and as the man stepped out into the bright morning light, disappearing from view, John felt a strange unease settle over him. He didn't know who that man was or what he represented, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he finished the last of his coffee, John caught Ellie's eye again. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, as if asking if everything was all right. He nodded slightly, though the truth was far more complicated. Something had shifted today, something beyond the confrontation with Charlie, beyond the tension in the diner. It was a feeling, deep in his gut, that told him his life was about to take a turn, whether he was ready for it or not. Echoes of the past. John sat at the table for a long time after the mysterious man left, the sounds of the cafe fading into a distant hum. His thoughts swirled as he replayed the conversation in his mind. There was something unnerving about it, something that made him feel exposed. It wasn't just the man's knowledge of his past. It was the weight of his words, as if they carried more than just an offer. A warning, maybe. A challenge. The cafe door swung open, jolting John back to the present. He looked up to see Ellie making her way over, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Her earlier confidence had given way to uncertainty, and she seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking. Are you all right, Mr. Carter? She asked softly, her voice laced with concern. That man, he didn't mean any harm, did he? John smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm fine, Ellie. He was just someone passing through. Ellie bit her lip, clearly unconvinced, but too polite to push the issue. Instead, she glanced at the empty chair across from him, as if trying to gauge the significance of the encounter. I didn't mean to pry, but he seemed different, like he wasn't just here by chance. John nodded, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't. Ellie looked as though she wanted to ask more, but instead, she changed the subject. Charlie's gone, by the way. Sheriff took him in for questioning. Don't know what'll come of it, but at least he's out of here for now. John's gaze drifted toward the window, where the sky was a pale blue, streaked with the soft glow of mid-morning sunlight. Yeah, but people like him, they don't just disappear. He'll be back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they always come back. Ellie shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his words sinking in. What are you going to do? You could leave, you know. Find somewhere better. Somewhere where you won't have to deal with people like Charlie. John smiled again, this time with a touch of sadness. It's not that simple, Ellie. You can't just outrun this kind of thing. Trust me. I've tried. There was a long pause as the two of them sat in the quiet cafe, the world outside carrying on as usual. Ellie looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke again. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. About everything. You shouldn't have to go through this. Not after everything you've done. John's chest tightened at her words. He had heard similar sentiments before, from well-meaning people who didn't fully understand the depth of the struggle. It wasn't about one moment, one person, or even one confrontation. It was about the constant grin, the unrelenting pressure of a world that still refused to see him as equal, no matter how many battles he fought or victories he won. Don't be sorry, Ellie, he said quietly. I'm not. Before she could respond, the door swung open again, but this time it wasn't a customer who entered. It was the sheriff, his large frame filling the doorway. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and deep-set eyes that had seen their share of trouble in this small town. He walked over to John's table with deliberate slowness, as if weighing every step. John, the sheriff greeted him with a nod, his voice low and measured. Can we talk for a minute? John gestured to the chair across from him, and the sheriff sat down heavily, removing his hat and placing it on the table. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, no words exchanged. There was history between them, unspoken but understood. The sheriff had been a younger man when John first came to town, a veteran himself, though their paths had been very different. He had always respected John's service, but respect didn't always translate into action. Not when the color of your skin still set you apart. I heard about what happened, the sheriff began, his tone cautious. Charlie's in custody for now. We'll have a formal hearing in a couple of days. John nodded but remained silent. The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Look, I know this isn't the first time you've had to deal with him. I also know it probably won't be the last. But this town, it's set in its ways, John. People don't change overnight. John leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the sheriff's. I'm not asking people to change overnight. I'm asking for justice, fair treatment. That's not too much to ask, is it? The sheriff met his gaze, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. You and I both know how these things go. There's gonna be people who side with Charlie no matter what. Folks who think he was just protecting the cafe from trouble. John's jaw tightened. Trouble? I was sitting here minding my own business. What kind of trouble was I causing? The sheriff shook his head. I don't mean you, John. I mean the situation. You know how it is. John's voice dropped, dangerously low. Yeah, I know how it is. The sheriff exhaled deeply, shifting in his seat. I'm not here to make excuses for anyone, least of all Charlie. But I am here to make sure things don't get worse. And right now, this town, it's a powder keg waiting to blow. A lot of folks aren't happy with how things are changing. People are on edge. John leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. So what do you expect me to do? Just sit back and take it. The sheriff held up a hand, as if trying to calm the rising tension. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, maybe it's time to think about what's next. This town ain't what it used to be, and it might not be the place for a man like you anymore. John's eyes narrowed. A man like me. The sheriff winced, realizing his mistake. I didn't mean it like that. What I'm trying to say is, maybe it's time to move on. Start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere that'll appreciate what you've done. John's heart pounded in his chest. The sheriff's words echoed Ellie's suggestion from earlier, but hearing it from a man in a position of authority stung in a different way. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a reminder of his place. A reminder that no matter how hard he fought, the odds would always be stacked against him here. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's. I fought for this country. I shed blood for people who don't even know my name. And now you're telling me that I don't belong here. That after everything I've been through, I should just pack up and leave. The sheriff stood as well, his expression conflicted. I'm not saying it's right, John. I'm saying it's reality. John's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. I've dealt with reality my whole life, but that doesn't mean I have to accept it. Without waiting for a response, John turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving the sheriff standing there, his hat still on the table. As the door closed behind him, the fresh air hit John's face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. He walked down the street, his mind racing with thoughts of the past, the present, and the uncertain future. Every step felt heavy, like he was carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. The stranger's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You've attracted attention, whether you meant to or not. John didn't know where his path would lead him next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As he made his way down the street, people watched him from their windows and doorways, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and respect. He had always been an outsider here, but now, more than ever, he was a man caught between two worlds, the one he had fought for and the one that still resisted his presence. But John Carter wasn't just a man to be forgotten. He was a symbol, a reminder that some battles never truly end. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He would keep walking it, no matter how long it took. A reckoning at dawn. The air was thick with tension the next morning. John could feel it even before he stepped outside. The town, usually so quiet at this hour, seemed to buzz with an undercurrent of something dark and unspoken. He hadn't slept much, his mind racing with fragments of the past and the uncertain future. There were times in his life when silence was a blessing, when the stillness allowed him to think clearly, to find his way through the fog of war or the confusion of a new battle. But this morning, the silence felt oppressive. John dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, his mind on autopilot. He had been through enough mornings like this to know what was coming. Confrontation. Reckoning. He didn't know the exact shape it would take, but he could sense it. The town had been building toward something for a long time, and now, with Charlie's arrest and the stranger's ominous visit, it seemed like everything was about to erupt. He strapped on his boots, pausing for a moment as his fingers traced the scuffs and worn leather. These boots had carried him through more battles than he cared to count. They had walked on foreign soil, across deserts and jungles, through rain and fire. Now they were about to walk him into yet another fight, but this one felt different, more personal. The sun was just beginning to rise as John stepped outside. The streets were still mostly empty, but here and there, he saw figures standing in doorways, watching him. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to break. John made his way toward the cafe, knowing that if anything was going to happen, it would happen there. The cafe had become a symbol in the last few days, a focal point for the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. It was where Charlie had made his stand, where the stranger had appeared with his cryptic warnings, and where John had decided, once again, not to back down. As he approached, he saw the sheriff's car parked outside. The sight of it made John's stomach tighten. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down he knew today wasn't going to end peacefully. John pushed open the door to the cafe and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the morning. The few people inside, mostly regulars, looked up at him, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Behind the counter, Ellie stood frozen, her eyes wide as they met his. She seemed to sense what was coming too. The sheriff was seated at the same table as yesterday, his hat resting on the table in front of him. He didn't look up when John entered but gestured for him to sit down. John walked over slowly, each step deliberate, as if he were walking into battle. "You know why I'm here," the sheriff said, his voice low, once John had taken his seat. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest, his eyes locking onto the sheriff's. "I've got a pretty good idea." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose again, a gesture that seemed to have become a habit. "Charlie's people, they're not happy. They think I'm siding with you. They think you're stirring up trouble." John's jaw clenched. "I'm sitting here drinking coffee. How does that stirring up trouble?" The sheriff didn't answer, but his silence said enough. It wasn't about what John had done. It was about who he was and what he represented. To men like Charlie and his supporters, John wasn't just another veteran, another man trying to live his life in peace. He was a threat, a reminder that their time, their way of thinking, was coming to an end. "They're coming for you, John," the sheriff said after a long pause. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when they do, I don't think I'll be able to stop them." John's eyes narrowed. "You're the sheriff. It's your job to stop them." The sheriff met his gaze, his face hardening. "I'm one man, John. And this town is stuck in the past. There's only so much I can do." John felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "So what are you saying? You want me to run, pack up and leave, let them win?" The sheriff shook his head. "I'm saying you've got to be smart. You've got to think about what's best for you, for your future. You stay here, and it's only a matter of time before something happens, something bad." John leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I didn't fight in 2 wars just to come home and run from a bunch of cowards hiding behind their fear and ignorance. I've faced worse than Charlie and his people, and I'm not going anywhere." The sheriff didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes searching John's face. Finally, he sighed and stood up, placing his hat back on his head. "I figured you'd say that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table in front of John. "This is for you." John looked down at the paper, but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "Just read it," the sheriff said quietly. John unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the handwritten note. As he read, his heart sank. It was a letter from one of the town's most influential families, a warning, thinly veiled as an invitation. They wanted him gone. They were offering him money, a chance to leave peacefully, to avoid further conflict. John crumpled the paper in his fist, the anger he had been holding back now bubbling to the surface. "So this is it. They think they can just buy me off, make me disappear." The sheriff's expression was pained. "They're scared, John. People like them, they don't know how to deal with change. They see you as a threat, and they're not the type to back down." John stood up, towering over the sheriff, his voice filled with quiet fury. "I'm not for sale. Not now, not ever." The sheriff didn't flinch, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I know that, John, but they don't." John stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking out of the cafe, the crumpled letter still clutched in his hand. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the street. As he walked, he could feel the weight of every gaze on him, the silent judgment of a town caught between 2 worlds. When he reached the edge of town, he stopped, looking out at the open road that stretched beyond the horizon. For a brief moment, he considered it, leaving, starting fresh somewhere new. But then he thought of all the people like him who had been forced to run, to hide, to make themselves small so that others could feel big. He thought of the men and women who had fought alongside him, who had given everything for a country that still didn't see them as equals. "No," He wasn't going anywhere. John turned back toward the town, his shoulders squared, his heart steady. He wasn't a man to be bought, intimidated, or pushed aside. This was his home, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. Not today. Not ever. As he walked back toward the cafe, the sun fully rising behind him, he knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But John Carter had never backed down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost.